and you're very successful with them, it might be because you're both trauma survivors. You know? If you're working very successfully with somebody who is a trauma survivor and you're a woman who's also a trauma survivor, you will know that you can't do the stuff that we normally do in the generic mental patient treatment, you know, the rehab stuff. You know, many people, and I don't know what the data is here in England. In the States, the data that we have suggests that somewhere between 60 and 70% of the people diagnosed with serious mental illness have either been physically or sexually abused at some point in their life. Okay? So that's like the majority of folks, right? How many of you are familiar with some of the more effective ways to intervene for trauma survivors? How many of you sort of know about, for example, domestic violence, kinds of interventions, or interventions with people who have experienced sexual violence and so forth? Well, the models that we use to get people to find their voice, to break the silence, to come out of the closet about that stuff, to create a safe environment, to find a safe environment for themselves and build that, are completely different from the models we use in rehabilitation, for psychiatric disability, clubhouses, all this other stuff. Often they're gender-specific models, okay? Often women who have been abused learn best and recover best with other women. But all the time we were designing our programs, including continuous treatment teams and all this other stuff we do, we never looked at gender. We never said that was real important. And it's incredibly important in terms of what's helpful and what's not helpful, especially if you overlay trauma issues on it. So the point is to not be able to talk about that in team meeting, you know, as to why you're successful with a person is ridiculous. And the problem is really an organizational one. It gets back to our professional training. But the sad thing is I think many mental health staff, for good reasons, do not feel safe within their program sharing with other staff, and particularly with their supervisors, some of the challenges they've faced in their life. And yet it's those challenges and how they've responded to them that represent their best tools, often. But we have created mental health environments where that's not safe to do several things. I mean, it's not safe in most mental health environments for staff to say they've had problems. It's not safe in mental health environments for clients to say they're really angry. You know, there's certain rules we have. And the bottom line on that is when we create organizations like that or allow them to stay that way, because we have the power to change them, we're basically creating in organizations that do not promote recovery. Because if it's not safe for you to share a bunch of stuff, then it's not safe for consumers to share a bunch of stuff and so forth. And I get really excited going into mental health programs where the staff have kind of taken back the culture and taken over the norms and said, this is ridiculous. This has to be the one safe place where staff can say, I'm in recovery in this particular way, and if you have some clients who have been through that, why don't you get a hand from me and I'll help you work with them on that. You see the difference in what would happen rather than, there's a wonderful story of a consumer-run program called Mind Empowered in Portland, Oregon. And it's very relevant to folks working for the trust because what happened was the Oregon mental health system, the state, wanted to shut down one of the larger wards in the state hospital in Portland. And they went each year to the professional community mental health center there, the equivalent of the trust, and they said, we'll give you some money and we want you to help all those people move out and resettle in the community. We want you to serve them. And each year the community mental health program said, no, we won't do it because you're not offering us enough money. We need at least 2 or 3 times that amount of money. And so they went back and forth and nothing happened and all these long stay patients were stuck in this facility. Well, finally the state got so frustrated they went to a local consumer group that had a bunch of very talented people. It was a well-established group. And they said, is there anything you can do to help get some of these people out of the hospital? And they said, well, what was the deal? The consumer group said, well, what was the deal you were offering the mental health center? And they said, we were offering them $1.6 million or something to create a program. The consumer group thought about that for a while and they said, let's think about it. And they said, okay, we'll do it, and we'll do it for that amount of money. And you know, it was kind of a very gutsy thing to do because when you're doing a program for people moving out of the hospital, as you know, you can't just do the self-help stuff. You've got to do the 24-hour crisis, you've got to do the continuous treatment teams, you've got to do everything, right? And this consumer group said, we would rather learn how to do that stuff than leave those 40 people stuck there for another 3 years while people fight back and forth about who's going to fund it. So that group did what some of you have done what the North Birmingham Trust has done, which they started to learn about service models. They went off to Madison, Wisconsin. They did all this stuff. And they created continuous treatment teams, 24-hour crisis services based on a lot of it on the Madison approach. And they created a community system that with the money they were given, but the system was entirely and is entirely staffed by consumers who happen to also be professionals. Okay, so it's different. It has a strong recovery orientation, very self-help oriented. Well, why do I tell you this story? The funny part of the story is, and the interesting part, comes right back to the point we're talking about being a mental health worker in an environment where it's not safe to be to disclose. And this consumer group, which had wonderful talents, but also, of course, like we all do, had certain attitudes, decided that the one group of staff that they would not be able to recruit service users from was psychiatrists. They said, you know, we're going to have to get some psychiatrists in here, and the problem is because of the way psychiatrists have been trained, we're going to have to retrain them in a consumer-oriented approach. So they developed a lot of training materials to retrain these psychiatrists they were going to hire, and then the glorious day came and they put the ads all over Oregon in the newspapers to recruit psychiatrists to work in this consumer-operated program. Anybody have a guess what happened? What did you say?
No application.
No applications. That's not what happened.
A lot of psychiatrists have been through the system and pretend it happens.
That's right. You know what happened? They were deluged with applications. They were only hiring 3 or 4 psychiatrists, and they got 17 applications from people who had been hospitalized in psychiatric hospitals. So they had, for 3 or 4 positions, they had 17 applicants who were already consumers. And do you know what those applicants said over and over again in their applications?
They couldn't say it before.
That's right. They said, I would love to work in a place where my history of mental illness was an asset instead of something I had to hide every day. Now, what is it? How could we set up organizations to, quote, treat people with mental illness when you had to hide the fact that you have a mental illness? I mean, what does it say? Isn't that weird? It's like we've been talking about employment for maybe just the last 10 years in mental health, employing and having helping service users get jobs, right? We've just started talking about that in the last 10 years, right? What is the largest single group of organizations that actively discriminate against people with mental illness in employment? Mental health organizations. No, it's true. I mean, you look, there are written policies in many, many organizations.